How well do we ever truly know the ones we love? Do we see them for who they are, or for who we need them to be? These questions linger, hauntingly simple yet deeply unsettling, lingering in the quiet spaces of a life that seemed, to anyone watching, like the picture of stability. Nolan Hastings, a man whose life was structured as precisely as the buildings he designed. In his world, every line, every detail had purpose. Everything in place. A successful architect by profession, a husband by devotion, and a man who believed that trust was as solid as any foundation he could lay. Elise, his wife, was as much a part of that foundation as any beam or brick. 10 years into their marriage, she was the steadying presence, the kind of partner he believed was as committed to their life together as he was. With her sharp intelligence, boundless warmth, and effortless grace, Elise had woven herself into the fabric of Nolan's life. Their lives seemed to complement each other seamlessly. She was the compassionate one, the listener, the one who brought levity to his intensity. Friends envied them, admiring how they had what many would call a perfect life, a phrase perhaps that anyone would admire: a comfortable home in a quiet, tree-lined suburb, a close-knit circle of friends, frequent travel, and a shared love for small luxuries, weekend getaways, impromptu dinners out, and cozy evenings spent watching the flames dance in the fireplace. By all accounts, they were the epitome of what people thought a happy, fulfilled couple should be. And Nolan believed it because he wanted to. He saw what he wanted to see: stability, partnership, a love that could weather any storm. But life has a way of leaving hints, faint and often unnoticed, like whispers in the background of a familiar song. One by one, things began to appear, not alarms, just fragments that could easily be dismissed. It was small at first: a change in her laughter, a new distance in her smile. Nights spent apart for what she called work functions that seemed to stretch longer and grow more frequent. A lingering silence that settled between them where conversation used to flow effortlessly. Perhaps he should have looked closer, but Nolan trusted her, or rather, he trusted the life they had built together. 10 years of love, laughter, and memories, 10 years where, to him, she had been an unwavering constant. He told himself it was just a phase, an adjustment, one of those ebbs that every marriage endures. Until one evening something happened. It was a moment so ordinary, so fleeting, that it could easily have gone unnoticed. But this time it caught his eye. A late notification on her phone, one text, a mere blink of a message. Just one small light on her screen. Yet, in that instant, something stirred within him. A feeling he couldn't quite name. A feeling that clashed with everything he believed about their marriage. He dismissed it as nothing, as paranoia perhaps, but that feeling refused to fade. It sat there, unanswered, as if beckoning him to look closer. As he found himself gazing at that phone, an unsettling thought took root. It was a feeling of uncertainty that he couldn't shake, one that seemed to speak to him in a voice he barely recognized. That night, Nolan stood on the edge of a choice that would change everything. And so, with this single moment, a life so carefully built began to shift, revealing questions he never thought he'd have to ask. Was it all an illusion? Had he missed something crucial all along? How could the person he thought he knew better than anyone else be hiding something so profound? And if he was wrong about her, what else in their life wasn't as it seemed? This story is about trust, how it builds and binds two people, and how, with a single crack, it can come crashing down. Join us as we walk through the unraveling, the hidden moments, and the buried secrets that lay beneath the surface of a love that was in so many ways almost perfect. To understand how a life together could begin to fracture, we must first step back to see who these people truly were and the foundations that bound them. Nolan Hastings grew up in a small, tight-knit town, a place where trust and loyalty weren't just ideals, they were the fabric of life. His father, a factory worker who clocked in day after day with unwavering dedication, taught him the value of commitment. His mother, the steady force at home, was the person everyone could rely on for a word of wisdom or a hot meal. In Nolan's world, loyalty was an unspoken vow, a core principle that guided every decision. As Nolan entered adulthood, he carried these values like a compass, using them to steer his life, his career, and eventually his marriage. He was the kind of man who didn't stray from his promises, the type who put others before himself, who chose family over fleeting ambitions. Becoming an architect suited him perfectly. He enjoyed the precision, the discipline, the satisfaction of watching ideas take physical form. Every blueprint, every corner, every line held meaning. Much like his profession, his love for Elise was structured, dependable, built on a foundation he thought was immovable. In their early years together, Nolan's dedication showed in countless ways. Late nights at the office were rare because he'd rather spend the evening at home, cooking dinner or helping Elise with her own projects. Promotions that would have taken him away more frequently were turned down. just so he could keep a semblance of balance and focus on what truly mattered. While Nolan was passionate about his work, Elise was always his priority. He made his choices around her, planning their lives, vacations, even day-to-day moments, with her happiness at the center. For 10 years, he kept to this path, and every time he glanced back, it seemed the sacrifices were worth it. Nolan believed himself fulfilled, believed that in their quiet, steadfast way, they were a model couple, two people who could weather the demands of life without falling out of step. He had done everything right, or so he thought. But perhaps life doesn't always follow the straight lines we try to draw. Elise was a woman defined by contrast. Raised in the city, her upbringing couldn't have been more different from Nolan's. Her parents, successful in their own ways but deeply distracted by their careers, were people who valued ambition over attachment, who believed self-reliance was the only path to a meaningful life. While Nolan's home was one of togetherness, Elise's was one of independence, where love was present but rarely spoken aloud. She became, by necessity, self-sufficient and resilient, learning to find her place in a world that often felt distant and demanding. Elise became magnetic in her own right, a blend of charm, intelligence, and effortless confidence. She was the woman people noticed not just because of her looks, but because she exuded the type of self-assurance that seemed to promise success. Friends gravitated towards her, colleagues respected her ambition. She was, by all accounts, a rising star in the business world, admired for her quick mind and charm that could turn a room in her favor. Yet, beneath the surface, there was always a sense that Elise longed for something she couldn't quite name. When she met Nolan, his stability was, to her, a revelation. Here was a man who represented everything her life had lacked: consistency, commitment, a quiet sort of love that required no show or pretense. He was her anchor, the force that promised her a life removed from the restless, chaotic world she'd always known. In Nolan, Elise found a balance, a steadying presence that made her feel, for the first time, that she could be part of something lasting. Something began to shift. The life she thought she wanted began to feel smaller. The routines that had once seemed comforting now felt confining. The drive that had once brought her professional success now created a hunger that her personal life could never quite satisfy. She didn't know when it happened or how, but as Nolan built his world around her, Elise began to feel as though she were slipping away. Their life together started with every bit of promise they had hoped for. Flashback to their early years, moments of laughter, shared dreams, and the kind of partnership that seemed solid and unbreakable. Their first date was simple yet memorable. A quiet evening in a cozy cafe where they talked for hours, their laughter punctuating the quiet ambience. It was then that Nolan knew he'd found someone he wanted to spend his life with, someone who completed him in ways he hadn't known he needed. Their wedding was a beautiful day, filled with friends and family. They exchanged vows, looking into each other's eyes with a sense of certainty. Nolan's friends saw him as lucky, landing a woman like Elise who was as brilliant as she was captivating. Elise's friends remarked on how grounded Nolan made her, how his calm energy seemed to soften her. In those early years, they were a team, navigating the small trials and joys of newly life. As the years went on, there were sacrifices, moments where Nolan put aside his dreams to support Elise's rising career, and times when Elise leaned into the stability of their life together, finding respite in Nolan's dependable presence. Together, they built a comfortable life, complete with everything they thought would sustain them. A lovely home, evenings spent planning for the future, and an unspoken understanding that they would always be there for each other. But sometimes, even the most carefully constructed lives have cracks, and those cracks can go unnoticed until something forces them to the surface. The routine moments that once brought them together now became routine in a different way, each lost in their own world more often than not. Nolan's stability, once a source of strength, began to feel rigid to Elise, while her ambition, which had once inspired him, now seemed like an invisible force pulling her away. Nolan noticed changes, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to plant seeds of doubt he couldn't shake. He brushed them aside, unwilling to question the foundation he'd spent so long building. Perhaps he was imagining things, seeing issues that weren't really there. After all, he and Elise had made it this far, but doubt has a way of lingering, of finding its way into the small spaces between two people. And even as they went through the motions, those seeds grew. A few missed dinners here, a long silence there. They moved in the same house, shared the same bed, but in those quiet moments, Nolan could feel an absence, a growing distance that he couldn't explain. What began as a perfect partnership had, in its own way, changed. Each flashback revealed not just memories but reminders of the life they had built, and the silent question that hung over them both: were they the same people who had once stood by each other with such unwavering devotion? And so, as the scene fades back to the present, we find Nolan standing on the precipice of questions he never thought he'd have to ask. He could feel that something was different, but he wasn't sure if he wanted to know what it was. 10 years of love, loyalty, and memories had brought them here, to a moment that could undo everything he'd believed in. This is a story of two lives that were once intertwined, and the distance that can form even between the closest of hearts. A story where trust, that vital thread, begins to fray, leaving a man who once thought he had everything wondering if he truly knew the woman beside him at all. Nothing changed all at once. Rather, it happened like the slow fading of color, like a song played so often that its melody blurs into background noise. Nolan had always known Elise to be a busy woman, a driven woman, but over time, her hours out of the house stretched longer, her return home punctuated by weary sighs and quick goodnights. Nolan told himself that it was just a busy season. The world demanded so much of her, and he trusted that, eventually she'd circle back. They had built a life, hadn't they? That had to mean something. But then came the first signs of a different kind of absence. It was the small things he noticed first. Elise started spending more time in her own world, her phone always close, her laughter faintly heard from the next room. She had taken on new clients, she explained, projects that demanded her attention. He listened, nodded, told her to do what she needed, but some part of him couldn't quite shake the feeling that her laughter wasn't meant for him anymore. More often than not, she had new plans that he hadn't heard of until moments before she left. Dinners with friends, meetings with clients, gatherings with people he had never met. And it was strange because Elise had never been one to keep things from him. They had shared everything, their routines, their friends, their private jokes. Now he felt like he was being pushed to the periphery of her life, a spectator watching her world spin away from him. As her late nights grew more frequent, Nolan's mind wandered, his imagination filling the gaps she left behind. He'd hear the car pull into the driveway at midnight, hear her move quietly through the house, as if she didn't want to disturb him. She'd slip into bed with a barely whispered goodnight, her voice as distant as her touch. He would lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that everything was fine. She was just tired. She was busy. There was no reason to doubt her. And yet, each new night brought a nagging question, one he couldn't silence, no matter how hard he tried. Nolan's instinct was to dismiss these thoughts. After all, they had been married for 10 years. They had shared a life together that had always seemed rock solid. He told himself it was just his own insecurity, his mind playing tricks on him. But once the questions took hold, they grew roots that he couldn't pull out. He caught himself waiting for her, glancing at the clock when it grew late, counting the minutes until her headlights cut through the dark. And each time she walked in the door, his relief was tinged with a flicker of suspicion he couldn't ignore. Days turned into weeks, and the space between them widened, an unspoken gulf that neither addressed. Conversations became polite, careful, almost clinical. The laughter that had once flowed so freely between them now felt like a relic of a different time. Every night he'd try, in small ways, to reach her, to talk, to bridge the invisible distance. He'd ask how her day went, try to draw her into conversation, but her responses were clipped, vague, dismissive. The woman he had loved so easily was slipping further from his grasp, her thoughts wrapped in some world he could neither see nor understand. Sometimes he'd find her lost in thought, her expression distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. When he'd call her name, she'd snap back, almost startled, quickly masking whatever had been on her mind. And when he tried to press further, to ask her what was troubling her, she'd deflect, brush it off with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Nolan's mind went to dark places. He wondered if he had done something wrong, if he had somehow failed her. Every small action, every forgotten gesture replayed in his mind, but he came up empty. He had been there, hadn't he? He had made time for her, listened to her, done everything he thought a husband should. But the self-doubt gnawed at him, whispering that he had missed something crucial, something that had driven her away. And then, the clues began to appear, subtle but unmistakable. He'd catch a glimpse of her talking on the phone, her voice hushed, her back turned to him as if she didn't want him to overhear. When he entered the room, she'd quickly end the call, slipping the phone into her pocket with a casualness that felt rehearsed. He told himself it was nothing, just her being private, but there was a guardedness to her that he couldn't ignore. It was a quiet morning when he noticed the first real shift in her appearance. Elise had always taken care of herself, but there was something different now, a new meticulousness, an attention to detail that hadn't been there before. She bought new clothes, a wardrobe that seemed almost unfamiliar, sleek and refined in a way that felt like a departure from the woman he had known. She wore perfume he didn't recognize, the scent lingering in the air long after she'd left the house. She took more time getting ready, lingering in front of the mirror with a concentration he had rarely seen. Nolan tried to brush it off, but each change felt like a small betrayal, as if she were preparing herself for someone else. And that thought, once it took hold, became a weight he couldn't shake. He began noticing things that might have slipped by him before: a trace of lipstick on the rim of a glass that wasn't there when he'd set the table, an unfamiliar text alert on her phone that she quickly dismissed. She spent more time on her phone, her eyes scanning the screen with an intensity that left him feeling invisible, as though he were no longer a part of her world. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, he couldn't hold back any longer. He looked at her, his gaze steady, searching for something familiar in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with a quiet desperation. Elise paused, her fork hovering mid-air, before giving him a practiced smile that felt as hollow as it looked. "Everything's fine," she replied, her tone flat, dismissive. But Nolan could feel it, that tiny, undeniable fracture between them. He watched her, studying the way her eyes darted away, the faint unease that lingered in her expression. It was as if she were holding a piece of herself just out of reach, a part of her he could no longer touch. And with each passing day, the distance grew, an invisible chasm that he couldn't bridge, no matter how hard he tried. Late at night, after she had fallen asleep, he'd lie awake, wrestling with thoughts he didn't want to believe. His mind painted pictures he couldn't bear to see, images of Elise in another world, laughing, sharing pieces of herself that she no longer gave to him. And with every whispered call, every guarded glance, every change he couldn't explain, he felt himself slipping into a darkness he had never known. His life, once so full of certainty, now felt like a fragile illusion, one that could shatter at the slightest touch. He tried to hold on to the memories, the moments they had shared, the promises they had made. But those memories felt distant now, like echoes of a time that no longer belonged to him. He couldn't deny it anymore. Something was wrong, something he couldn't name but could feel in every fiber of his being. Despite everything, he stayed silent, unwilling to confront the truth he feared most. To question her was to risk unraveling the life they had built, the love he had given so freely. And so he waited, clinging to the hope that this was just a passing storm, that whatever was pulling her away would fade, and they would find their way back to each other. But in the deepest part of his mind, Nolan knew that some things once lost could never be reclaimed. And as he lay awake in the dark, the weight of suspicion pressing down on him, he began to wonder if he had ever truly known her at all. It was late, the kind of quiet evening where even the soft hum of the refrigerator felt amplified. Nolan and Elise were home together, moving through the comfortable routine that had become their life. They had shared a simple dinner, exchanged pleasantries about their day, and now, as the evening settled around them, they seemed to drift to their usual corners of solitude. Elise excused herself, slipping out of the room with her phone left unattended on the counter. She was heading for a shower, her steps slow, her mood distant, almost as if she were relieved to escape the weight of the unspoken tension that lingered in the air. Nolan stood there, watching her retreating figure disappear around the corner, the faint sound of the bathroom door clicking shut echoing in his ears. He looked at her phone, lying face down on the counter, and suddenly everything else in the room faded away. It was a small, seemingly innocent object. Yet tonight, it felt like a forbidden key, a door he was both terrified and compelled to open. He took a step closer, his heartbeat quickening, a faint pulse in his temples urging him to resist. He told himself he had no right to invade her privacy. This was Elise's phone, her space, her world. And yet, something deep within him, something rooted in months of suspicion, nudged him forward. It was a quiet war between loyalty and curiosity, between trust and the gnawing doubt that had become his constant companion. His fingers hovered over the device, his conscience screaming at him to walk away. But in that moment he couldn't, he needed to know.
Taking a shaky breath, he reached down and turned the phone over, his hand trembling as he did. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, a message notification, innocuous at first glance, yet somehow possessing a gravity that pulled him in.
The message preview showed only a handful of words, words that should have meant nothing. But they carried an intimacy, a familiarity he couldn't ignore. The name, unfamiliar and unsettling, stood at the top of the screen. "Had a great time with you today, can't stop thinking about it." The words struck him like a physical blow, hollowing out his chest, sending a cold shock through his veins. The world around him blurred, the walls seeming to close in as he stared, transfixed, at the screen. He didn't dare tap into the message further, as though the few words he'd seen already held all the betrayal he could bear. He let the phone slip from his hand back onto the counter, staring down at it as though it were some venomous creature. For a long, waited moment he stood there, his hands braced on the countertop, willing himself to breathe, to process the truth unraveling before him. The room was silent, unbearably so, his own ragged breathing the only sound as his mind spun. Disbelief and horror mingled with a rush of anger, a tidal wave of emotions crashing over him all at once. His hand shook, the room growing cold around him as he tried to grasp what he had just seen. He felt the weight of those words like an anvil on his chest, pressing down, crushing, searing through his composure. A part of him wanted to deny it, to convince himself that it was just a misunderstanding, a joke, perhaps even some work-related fluke. But the truth stared back at him with merciless clarity. That message, those few, damning words left no room for excuses, no room for the rational explanations he had clung to for so long. As he gripped the countertop, memories surfaced, unwelcome and piercing. He remembered the late nights, the guarded conversations, the way her laughter had faded when she looked at him, reserved only for someone else. Every suspicion he'd silenced, every doubt he'd ignored, now reared its head, each one echoing a truth he could no longer evade. And yet, he stood there, immobilized, his mind and body betraying him. The weight of betrayal settled into his bones, his thoughts a jumble of denial and heartbreak. He felt as though he were unraveling, each breath pulling at the fragile threads that held him together. He wanted to rage, to shout, to confront her, and demand answers. But a paralyzing numbness held him in place, the realization sinking deeper and deeper into him with each passing second. Inside his mind, a war raged. Part of him wanted to grab the phone, scroll through every message, every interaction to expose every secret she had hidden from him. He imagined opening her phone, finding all the answers, seeing every damning detail. But a quieter, more painful thought held him back, a fear of what else he might find, a dread of knowing the full extent of her betrayal. He clung to memories of their past, like a drowning man clutching at fragile driftwood. He remembered their wedding day, the vows they'd exchanged, the promises that had felt so solid, so unbreakable. He saw their first home together, the nights they'd stayed up talking about their future, their plans, their dreams. Had it all been a lie? Or had something real, something sacred, slipped through his fingers without him even noticing? As he wrestled with these thoughts, his mind flashed to questions he was unprepared to face. What had he done wrong? Had he failed her in some way? He replayed every moment, every interaction, searching for cracks he might have missed, for some sign that could explain why she had turned away from him. But no answer surfaced, only an overwhelming sense of failure, as though he had somehow lost her without ever knowing why. He couldn't bear to face the next steps, couldn't imagine how he'd confront her, how he'd put into words the betrayal he felt. The world that they had built together, the future he had imagined so clearly, now lay shattered at his feet. He was left standing in the ruins, torn between fury and heartbreak, between love and a bitterness that threatened to consume him. The sound of water from the bathroom faded, replaced by the soft creak of the door. Elise was coming back. Nolan barely had time to compose himself, the raw shock and devastation painted across his face. He straightened, his eyes lingering on the phone lying innocently on the counter, a damning reminder of everything that had just been torn apart. Elise appeared, wrapped in a towel, her hair damp, her face calm and unsuspecting. She looked at him with a faint smile, oblivious to the storm brewing within him, the pain simmering just beneath the surface. Nolan met her gaze, his mind racing, a thousand thoughts and emotions clamoring for release. But he swallowed them down, his face a practiced mask, his voice steady as he forced a smile, pretending, if only for a moment, that he hadn't seen the message, that he didn't know. As Elise moved past him, the smell of her perfume filling the space between them, Nolan felt the ache in his chest deepen. The truth lay before him, stark and undeniable, but he wasn't ready to confront it, not yet. So he let her walk away, let her brush past him with that same guarded distance, the same coldness that had crept into their lives. And he stood there, alone in the quiet, his world crumbling, his mind haunted by the message he could never unsee. The days that followed passed in a blur for Nolan, a storm of emotions raging within him, each one more turbulent than the last. He wandered through his own home as though it were foreign, each room a reminder of the life they had shared, now tainted by the betrayal he had uncovered. Every quiet moment, every empty silence, amplified the questions that clawed at him from within. How long had this been going on? How could she look at him, day after day, with this hidden world tucked away? He became a stranger even to himself, slipping into a routine that was mechanical, cold. Elise carried on as usual, seemingly unaware of the distance growing between them, the gap widening with every second he spent in silence. She would look at him, speak to him, all without realizing that he was no longer the same man. When he saw her, he struggled to hide the flash of hurt that crossed his face, the cold pang of betrayal that twisted his stomach each time she smiled or laughed, as though nothing had changed. In the quiet hours of the night when she slept beside him, he lay awake, his mind racing. He would study her face in the dim light, trying to see something, anything that would explain it all, that would give him answers. But her features remained serene, untouched by the turmoil she had unleashed. And as he watched her, a decision formed within him, a decision he would replay over and over in his mind, both dreading and longing for it. Days passed in an excruciating haze, each moment building up to the inevitable. Nolan spent hours lost in thought, turning over each memory, each interaction, searching for signs he might have missed. He remembered their first meeting, the laughter they had shared, the life they had built, and with each memory he felt a fresh wave of anger and sadness. The betrayal cut deep, its pain raw and unrelenting, but beneath it all was a simple, haunting question: why? To steady himself, he went for long drives, allowing the open road to offer a moment's reprieve from the thoughts that consumed him. Sometimes he found himself parked by the lake where they used to go together, staring out at the water, searching its depths for answers he knew would never come. Other times he found himself rehearsing the conversation in his mind, imagining how it would go, her responses, his words, the questions he would ask, and the explanations he hoped she could provide. But each time his words faltered, each scenario unraveling before he could bring himself to face the truth. With the decision made, he prepared himself, resolving to handle the confrontation calmly. He didn't want to lose control, to let his emotions turn what he hoped would be a moment of honesty into something explosive. He needed answers, yes, but more than that, he needed clarity. He needed to understand, to see her as she truly was, not as he had imagined her all these years. One evening, he finally chose the time. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind they had shared countless times before, yet tonight carried a heaviness he could scarcely bear. He set the scene, arranging the living room with an almost ceremonial care, tidying the space they had shared for so many years, as if preparing it for a sacred moment. He poured himself a glass of water, took a deep breath, and sat down, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the arm of the chair as he waited for her to come home. He watched the clock, each tick stretching the silence that filled the room. The minutes passed, slow and steady, his mind bracing itself for what was to come. In those moments alone, his resolve wavered, thoughts racing through his mind. Would she deny it? Would she lie? Or, worse, would she admit it without remorse, shattering the last remnants of the woman he thought he knew? He heard her car pull into the driveway, the soft thud of the car door closing, the familiar sound of her keys jingling as she approached the front door. He felt his heartbeat quicken, a surge of adrenaline rushing through him. His mouth was dry, his hands clammy, his mind a tangled mess of emotions and questions. The door opened and Elise stepped in, her usual smile flashing in greeting before fading, as she noticed the tension in his gaze, the seriousness etched into his expression. She looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly, sensing that something was wrong. She placed her bag down, her eyes searching his, as though trying to read what was hidden behind his calm exterior. Nolan felt the silence stretching between them, thick and suffocating. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words felt foreign, lodged in his throat. He wanted to demand answers, to ask the questions that had haunted him every waking hour, but he found himself hesitating, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could feel her eyes on him, expectant, wary, and he wondered if she already knew what he was about to say. "We need to talk, Elise," he said finally, his voice low, laced with a calm he didn't feel. He gestured for her to sit, his eyes not leaving hers, watching for any flicker, any hint of the truth he sought. She hesitated, her expression shifting subtly, a slight crease forming between her brows. But she obliged, settling into the armchair across from him, her gaze cautious, her posture tense. The silence stretched once more, filling the space between them with an intensity that made the air thick, almost tangible. He studied her, every detail of her face, every subtle shift in her expression, searching for something: guilt, remorse, or even indifference. Anything that would give him insight into her mind, into the secrets she had kept hidden. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady, controlled. "I saw a message on your phone. From someone I don't know. I didn't mean to invade your privacy." But he paused, swallowing the lump in his throat, willing himself to continue. "I read enough to know that there's something going on, something I didn't know about." Her face paled, her eyes widening just a fraction, but she remained silent, her gaze dropping to her hands. Nolan felt his heart clench, a wave of anguish washing over him. This was the moment, the breaking point they had been heading towards, the truth finally exposed, raw and undeniable. He forced himself to breathe, his voice softer now, pleading almost, "Why, Elise? Why didn't you tell me? Why keep something like this hidden from me?" His words hung in the air, vulnerable and desperate, revealing the pain he had tried so hard to mask. Elise remained silent, her face unreadable, her hands twisting in her lap. Nolan watched her, waiting, the seconds ticking by in agonizing silence. And as he looked at her, he felt his anticipation turning to dread, a sinking feeling that whatever answer she offered, it would never be enough to heal the wounds she had left in him. But he waited, his heart pounding, his entire world poised on the edge of her response, hoping, even now, that she could somehow make sense of the betrayal that had torn his life apart. Nolan felt his heart pounding as he sat across from her, each beat echoing in his ears as he watched her reaction. He took a deep breath, the words he'd been practicing for days finally finding their way to the surface. "Elise," he began, his voice steady but soft, "I need you to be honest with me. I need you to tell me the truth." He kept his gaze fixed on her, searching for something, anything that would give him insight, that would reveal the woman he thought he knew. She looked back at him, her eyes widening slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she quickly masked it with a tight smile. She tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Nolan, what are you talking about?" she asked, her tone light, almost dismissive. Her voice carried an edge of amusement, as if the very idea of his accusation was absurd. But Nolan didn't waver. He watched her, his expression unchanging, his eyes holding her in place. "I saw a message, Elise. On your phone. From someone I didn't recognize." For a moment her face remained impassive, and then he saw a brief flicker of something behind her eyes. Panic? Guilt? He couldn't be sure. But she recovered quickly, a dismissive laugh escaping her lips. "A message? Really, Nolan?" she replied, shaking her head. "You went through my phone. I can't believe this." He felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside, knowing that this wasn't the time to doubt himself. "It was a message that wasn't meant for me to see, was it?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You know what I'm talking about, Elise. Please, just tell me the truth." She looked away, her jaw clenching, her hands fidgeting in her lap. There was a crack in her mask, a hesitation that revealed her discomfort. She let out a sigh, her fingers playing with the hem of her shirt as she looked at anything but him. "Nolan, I don't know what you think you saw, but you're wrong. There's nothing going on." He shook his head slowly, the weight of her words settling over him like a dark cloud. "Don't do this, Elise. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Just be honest with me." But she held her ground, her expression hardening. "You're being paranoid," she said, her tone sharper now, defensive. "I don't know what kind of ideas you've been letting get into your head, but they're not true. I can't believe you'd even accuse me of something like this." For a moment he almost believed her. But then the memory of the message flashed through his mind, its words seared into his memory, each phrase a brutal confirmation of the truth he so desperately wanted to deny. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper, his hands trembling as he smoothed it out on the table in front of her. "Then what is this?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with a sadness he could no longer hide. He watched her as she looked down at the paper, her eyes widening as she saw the printed words, the message he had seen, copied word for word, each line a painful reminder of the betrayal he now faced. Her face paled, her composure cracking for the first time. She stared at the paper, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find the words. "Nolan," she began, her voice barely a whisper, a tremor of fear threading through her tone. "So it's true, then," he said, his voice breaking, the anger and hurt spilling out despite his efforts to contain it. "You were lying to me. All this time you've been lying." She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to take his, but he pulled away, the pain too raw, too fresh. "Nolan, please, it's not what you think. I can explain," she said, her voice cracking as the panic took hold. It was just a mistake. It meant nothing." "A mistake," he repeated, his tone laced with bitterness. "A mistake is forgetting our anniversary. A mistake is leaving the stove on. But this is," he trailed off, struggling to find the words, the depth of his hurt too profound to express. "It didn't mean anything," she insisted, her voice rising in desperation. "I swear it was a moment of weakness. I never meant to hurt you." He stared at her, the woman he had loved, the woman he had built his life with, feeling as though he were seeing her for the first time. He felt a surge of anger rising within him, his hands clenching into fists as he fought to keep his voice steady. "Would you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his tone hard, unforgiving. "Do you understand what this means? To me? To us?" She began to cry, her tears falling silently as she lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm so sorry, Nolan," she whispered, her voice choked with regret. "I never wanted this to happen. I don't know how, I don't know why I let it go this far." He felt his heart shatter at her words, the finality of her admission sinking in. "You don't know why," he echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. "You don't know why you betrayed the man who stood by you for years, who sacrificed for you, who's loved you with everything he has. You don't know why." She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen, her face etched with remorse. I was unhappy, Nolan. I felt like I was losing myself. I needed something more." Her words hit him like a physical blow, the weight of her confession too much to bear. "Something more," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wasn't I enough? Wasn't our life enough?" Her silence was answer enough, the unspoken truth hanging between them, a silent admission of the emptiness that had driven her to betray him. And in that moment he realized that the woman he had loved, the woman he had built his life with, was gone. In her place was a stranger, someone he could no longer recognize, someone who had torn his world apart. He rose from his seat, his movements slow, deliberate, as though he were moving through water. He felt numb, his mind reeling as he tried to process everything he had heard, everything he had lost. She reached out to him, her eyes pleading, her voice desperate as she called his name. But he didn't turn back. He couldn't. The pain was too deep, the betrayal too fresh. He walked out of the room, leaving her behind, her cries echoing in his ears as he made his way to the door. And as he stepped outside, the cool night air washing over him, he felt a strange sense of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders as he finally let go of the life he had once known. He stood there, staring up at the stars, their distant light a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed his heart. And in that moment, he realized that he was free. Free from the lies, the betrayal, the pain. Free to rebuild his life, to find a new path, one that would lead him away from the shadows of his past. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a glimmer of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness, a promise of a new beginning, one that he would build on his own, with no more secrets, no more lies. And as he walked away from the house, leaving the memories of their life behind, he knew that he was ready to face whatever the future held, ready to embrace the unknown with open arms. For in the end, he had found something far more valuable than the love he had lost. He had found himself. As the confrontation ended, silence settled over the room, a heavy, suffocating quiet that neither of them dared to break. They sat across from each other, each one unable to look away, yet unable to fully face the shattered reality before them. Nolan could hear her breath, rapid and uneven, as she clutched her hands together, her fingers digging into her palms as if to keep herself from unraveling completely. But he couldn't focus on her now. He could barely make sense of the torrent of emotions raging inside of him. There was pain, sharp and unrelenting, flooding every corner of his mind. It came in waves, each one stronger than the last, threatening to pull him under. Anger flared up, hot and blinding, followed closely by disbelief. How could she, as Elise, his partner, his wife of 10 years, be capable of something so devastating? How could he have been so oblivious, so trusting, to let this betrayal go unseen for so long? A part of him wanted to demand answers, to make her explain herself until there was nothing left unsaid. But another part, a quieter, sadder part, was too exhausted, too hurt to endure any more of her explanations, her justifications. He couldn't stomach the thought of hearing her say that she had been unhappy, that he had somehow failed to see the cracks forming in their life together. They sat that way for a long time, minutes stretching into an eternity, each lost in their own turmoil, their own fractured thoughts. Eventually, Elise rose to her feet, hesitating as she took a step toward him. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He glanced up at her, his expression unreadable, and for a fleeting moment, her guilt seemed to consume her, her shoulders slumping as she took a deep, shuddering breath. But Nolan's gaze hardened, his jaw clenched, and with a slight shake of his head, he looked away. Defeated, Elise turned and left the room, leaving him alone with the silence and the ruins of the life they had built together. In the quiet that followed, Nolan felt himself slipping into a dark, introspective space, his thoughts churning as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The betrayal gnawed at him, a wound that refused to close, and he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and loyalty. He could feel anger bubbling beneath the surface, an all-consuming rage that made him want to lash out, to make her feel the same pain she had inflicted on him. But beneath the anger was something far more complicated, a sense of loss that went beyond betrayal. He missed the Elise he thought he knew, the woman he had loved, the one he had shared his dreams with. He missed the certainty he had once felt, the unshakable belief that she was his forever. And as much as he wanted to condemn her, he couldn't completely sever the bond they had shared for so many years. The love he felt for her, despite everything, was still there, like an ember struggling to survive in the ashes of their relationship. He wondered if he was weak for feeling this way, if he was a fool for still caring about someone who had shown him such disregard. Part of him wanted to let go of all morality, to indulge in a revenge that would hurt her as deeply as she had hurt him. He imagined telling their friends and family, exposing her betrayal to everyone who thought they were the perfect couple. He pictured her shame, her guilt, the pain she would feel as their life together unraveled in front of everyone they knew. And yet, as he entertained these thoughts, a sense of unease began to settle over him. Was revenge truly what he wanted? Would it bring him the closure he so desperately needed? Or would it only add to the emptiness he felt, leaving him just as broken as he was now, if not more? He grappled with the question of justice versus forgiveness, feeling torn between his desire to move on and his need for some form of retribution. He thought back to the vows they had exchanged on their wedding day, the promises they had made to each other to love and cherish, to be faithful and true. Those words felt hollow now, their meaning stripped away by her actions, but he couldn't ignore the part of him that still yearned to honor those promises, to find some way to salvage the remnants of their relationship. And so he sat in silence, wrestling with his emotions, his mind a battleground of conflicting desires and moral dilemmas. He knew that whatever path he chose would shape the person he would become, that his response to this betrayal would define not only his relationship with Elise, but also his sense of self. He could feel himself standing on the edge of a precipice, torn between forgiveness and vengeance, love and hate. In the days that followed, Nolan withdrew into himself, struggling to navigate the pain and anger that had become a constant presence in his life. He went through the motions of his daily routine, but everything felt empty, as if a part of him had been hollowed out. He found himself avoiding friends, declining invitations, unable to bear the thought of pretending that everything was fine. The nights were the worst. In the quiet darkness, memories of happier times flooded his mind, taunting him with glimpses of what he had lost. He remembered their first date, the way she had laughed, the way her eyes had sparkled when she looked at him. He remembered the excitement they had felt on their wedding day, the promises they had made to each other, the future they had dreamed of building together. And now all of it felt like a cruel joke, a lie that had unraveled before his very eyes. Sleep became a distant memory, his nights spent pacing the floors, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. Why had she done it? Was there something he could have done to prevent this? Had he somehow failed her, or was this betrayal a reflection of something deeper, something he would never fully understand? As the days turned into weeks, he began to realize that he couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a cycle of anger and despair. He knew he had a choice to make, a decision that would determine the course of his life. He could hold on to the bitterness, let it consume him until there was nothing left of the person he once was. Or he could try to find a way to move forward, to rebuild his life, even if it meant letting go of the love he had once cherished. It was a daunting thought, the idea of starting over, of facing a future without the woman he had planned to grow old with. But as he stood there, staring at his reflection in the mirror, he felt a glimmer of determination, a flicker of strength he hadn't known he possessed. He didn't know what the future held, or if he would ever be able to truly forgive Elise for what she had done. But he knew that he couldn't let her actions define him, that he couldn't let this betrayal destroy the person he had worked so hard to become. And so, with a heavy heart, he made a decision to let go of the anger, to release the pain that had held him captive for so long. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But he was ready to face them, to rebuild his life one step at a time, to find a new path, even if it meant leaving behind the love he had once held so dear. In the quiet of that moment, he felt a sense of peace, a calm that had eluded him for weeks. And as he took a deep breath, he knew that he was finally ready to move forward, to leave the past behind, and to embrace the future with an open heart. He didn't know where this journey would lead him, or if he would ever truly be able to heal from the wounds she had inflicted. But he knew that he was stronger than he had ever realized, and that no matter what lay ahead, he would face it with courage, with resilience, and with the unwavering belief that he could rebuild his life, piece by piece, until he found happiness once more. In the days following the confrontation, Elise was overtaken by a flood of emotions that grew stronger each day. Guilt wrapped itself around her heart like a vise, tightening with each memory of Nolan's stunned, broken face when he'd discovered her betrayal. She had hurt him in ways she could barely bring herself to acknowledge. And now, in the wake of everything, her actions haunted her every thought, every waking moment. Elise found herself sifting through memories, retracing their relationship in an attempt to understand how she had let things come to this. She remembered the early days of their love, the warmth and ease between them, the dreams they had once shared. She saw with an agonizing clarity how she had taken his loyalty, his kindness, for granted, how she had allowed her own ambitions and insecurities to create a distance between them. The person she saw in the mirror now was almost unrecognizable. The guilt weighed so heavily that it seemed to hollow her out, piece by piece. In her solitude, she attempted to reach out to him, though every conversation was a reminder of the wall that had formed between them. Nolan's responses had grown colder, and each effort to apologize, to explain herself, seemed only to deepen the rift. And yet, she knew she couldn't give up. She couldn't walk away without at least trying to repair what she had broken. She had to face the consequences of her actions, even if it meant confronting the ugliest parts of herself. Seeking forgiveness wasn't just about making things right with him, it was also about confronting her own capacity for hurt and betrayal, something she had never thought herself capable of. Nolan, meanwhile, was undergoing a transformation of his own, though it was one marked by a different kind of pain and realization. The man who had once believed in unbreakable loyalty and unwavering trust was gone, replaced by someone who understood the harsh, unforgiving reality of human nature. His love for Elise was still there, but it had been tempered, hardened by the betrayal. Where once he had been willing to give everything, to sacrifice his own happiness for the sake of their marriage, now he found himself holding back, shielding his heart from further pain. He began to see his past devotion to her as both a strength and a flaw, realizing how much of himself he had invested in her happiness, often at the expense of his own. This revelation marked a turning point, a shift from shock and sorrow to a colder resolve. He knew that he couldn't return to the man he once was, that he had changed in ways that went beyond their relationship. He could feel a new sense of independence growing within him, a desire to rebuild his life without the weight of Elise's betrayal casting a shadow over him. Nolan's reflections became more focused, more deliberate. As he pondered the question of forgiveness, he found himself at a crossroads. He could either continue holding on to the anger and pain, letting it consume him, or he could choose to let go, to release himself from the chains of bitterness. But forgiveness was complicated. To forgive her would mean finding a way to understand, perhaps even empathize with the reasons behind her betrayal. And he wasn't sure he could or wanted to extend that level of grace. Trust, he realized, was at the heart of it all. It was something he had always valued, something he had once believed could never be broken between them. Now that trust was gone, and he questioned if it could ever truly be rebuilt. Could he find it within himself to forgive her, to offer her a second chance, knowing that the foundations of their relationship had been irreparably altered? Meanwhile, Elise grappled with her own questions of self-forgiveness and redemption. She knew that she could spend the rest of her life trying to make it up to him, but would it ever be enough? Could she, herself, live with the knowledge of what she had done, the hurt she had caused? These thoughts consumed her, yet she remained resolute in her attempts to reach out to Nolan, hoping to find a path forward, even if it meant facing his continued resentment. The nights grew longer, and each one brought them further into their separate worlds of reflection and remorse. For Elise, every interaction with Nolan was a painful reminder of the love she had lost, the man she had wronged. She watched as he grew more distant, his once warm gaze now guarded, his words clipped and measured. She knew that no amount of apologies could undo the past, but she was willing to try, to do whatever it took to prove that she was capable of change. For Nolan, these moments with Elise were a test of his own capacity for forgiveness. He could see her remorse, her guilt, but he also saw the person who had hurt him, who had betrayed the trust he had once held sacred. He found himself questioning the very nature of love and loyalty, wondering if there was a path forward that didn't require him to sacrifice his own sense of self. Could he forgive her without compromising the person he had become, the strength he had gained from enduring this pain? As they both grappled with these questions, themes of trust and forgiveness became the unspoken core of their journey. It wasn't just about their relationship anymore. It was about understanding the complexity of human flaws, the ways in which love could both uplift and destroy. Nolan came to see that forgiveness wasn't something he could give lightly, nor was it something he could offer purely for her sake. It had to be a decision he made for himself, a choice that would allow him to move forward, regardless of what the future held for them as a couple. The possibility of separation loomed, an unspoken tension that neither of them could ignore. Elise knew that, in seeking forgiveness, she was risking the very thing she wanted most, a chance to rebuild what they had lost. Nolan, on the other hand, saw separation as a way to reclaim his life, to free himself from the pain of betrayal. And yet, there was a part of him, a small, vulnerable part, that wondered if letting go completely would mean losing a piece of himself. A part of his past that he wasn't quite ready to say goodbye to. In the end, their journey became a testament to the fragility of love and the resilience of the human spirit. Both of them had changed, shaped by the pain they had endured, the choices they had made. Whether or not forgiveness was possible, whether or not their love could survive, they each knew that this experience had left an indelible mark on them, one that would shape the rest of their lives. As they stood at this crossroads, they realized that the path forward wasn't about erasing the past or pretending that the hurt hadn't happened. It was about accepting the imperfections in themselves and each other, about finding a way to live with the scars and perhaps even grow from them. For Nolan, forgiveness became less about reconciling with Elise and more about finding peace within himself. And for Elise, redemption meant facing her own flaws and learning to forgive herself, regardless of whether or not he would ever truly forgive her. In the quiet that followed, they each found a sense of resolution, a tentative acceptance of the uncertainty that lay ahead. Their journey wasn't over, but they had both come to understand that love, trust, and forgiveness were not simple absolutes. They were fragile, complicated, and ultimately deeply human. And as they took their first steps into this new chapter, they did so with a newfound resilience, a willingness to face whatever came next, one day at a time. Years passed. Time, as it so often does, shaped and softened the edges of their memories. Nolan and Elise had each gone on to live separate lives, their paths forever altered by the moment when trust shattered between them. Their love, once a vivid, defining part of their identities, had become a faded photograph, a reminder of who they were and the price they paid for the choices they made. Nolan found himself living in a city far from the one they had shared. He had thrown himself into his work with a renewed vigor, using each day as a step away from the hurt he had once felt so profoundly. The bitterness had lessened, and in its place was a quiet understanding, a recognition that life could never truly go back to the way it was. He had come to accept that betrayal was a part of the human experience, a wound that couldn't be erased, but, over time, could be carried with resilience. There were days when he wondered what could have been if things had been different, if trust had been stronger than temptation, if he could have forgiven her fully. Yet, these thoughts were fleeting, mere shadows on the edges of his new life. As for Elise, she had carved out a life that was different from the one she had once envisioned. She had chosen a quieter path, focusing on herself and the personal growth she had neglected for so long. Gone was the woman who had once needed validation from every source but her own. Her betrayal and the consequences it brought had led her to a harsh reckoning with herself. She had faced years of introspection, of grappling with guilt and regret, questioning why she had made the choices she did. Through this journey, she had come to understand the impact of her actions, not only on Nolan but on her own sense of identity. She had learned the price of deceit, the depth of her mistakes, and the difficulty of seeking forgiveness from herself. There were moments, in the solitude of a quiet morning, or the whisper of a familiar song, when she would be reminded of the life she had left behind, and the man she had once loved. Their paths never crossed again, yet each carried an invisible reminder of the other, a reminder of what they had shared, and what they had lost. Nolan, for his part, would often find himself reflecting on the nature of trust and loyalty. He'd come to see these qualities as fragile, valuable beyond measure, and deserving of careful protection. He had learned, too, that betrayal was a scar that healed slowly, if at all, and that true peace came only with acceptance, not vengeance or bitterness. Elise had learned, in her own way, that love without honesty was a brittle illusion, that self-deception was as corrosive as lying to another, and that forgiveness was not something she could ask for from anyone but herself. The years had given both of them the gift of perspective. Nolan had once believed that love could conquer all, that trust once given could never be shattered. But the reality had shown him otherwise, and he had come to terms with it. Elise had once thought that her own happiness was worth any price, but she had learned that the pursuit of happiness at the expense of integrity was a hollow victory. She now understood that the cost of her choices went far beyond a broken marriage. It had cost her a part of herself she could never fully reclaim. As they moved forward with their lives, each carried with them a quiet resilience, a deeper understanding of their own capacities and limitations. They had loved deeply, and they had hurt each other profoundly. Yet, In the end, the love they had once shared served as a silent reminder of both the beauty and the pain that life could bring. The ache of betrayal remained with them both, a bittersweet memory that, though faded, would never fully disappear. And so their story leaves us with questions that are both timeless and deeply personal. Can trust ever be fully restored once it has been broken? Can love survive betrayal, or does it become something else entirely wounded, altered, forever tinged with doubt? For those who have faced betrayal, the answers may vary. Some may choose to forgive and rebuild, finding strength and resilience in the capacity to move forward. Others, like Nolan, may choose a different path, accepting that some wounds are best left to heal on their own, away from the ones who caused them. Yet, this story isn't just about betrayal, it's about the truths we choose to live by, the promises we make, and the difficult choices that define us. It reminds us of the value of honesty, not just with others, but with ourselves, and of the weight our choices carry. Betrayal may fracture love, but it is the search for integrity, resilience, and forgiveness that defines how we live in its wake. In the end, their story leaves us with a thought: what would we do in their place? Would we forgive, or would we walk away in this way? Nolan and Elisa's story is a mirror, a quiet reminder of the complexities of love, trust, and the choices that shape our lives. Join us next time as we dive into more stories that explore the depths of love, trust, and the hidden sides of relationships. Every story is different, but each one offers a powerful reminder of what it means to love, to lose, and to discover ourselves along the way. Subscribe now and immerse yourself in these real-life narratives where every choice counts, every truth matters, and the questions we face are more complex than we could ever imagine.